Tell me something. Where are you right now? As these words reach you, are you listening from a city that never sleeps? The glow of neon still burning through your window? Or from a small town where the streets are empty and the night is so quiet it almost listens back? And what time is it there? Is it deep in the night, when even the clocks seem tired? Or just before dawn, when the air feels heavy with secrets waiting to be told? The hour matters, because some stories change depending on when you hear them. And this one belongs to the kind of darkness that doesn't just surround you. It settles inside you. Chapter 1. The Rise of Jimmy the Gent. James Burke, the man who would later become known simply as Jimmy the Gent, was born not into privilege, not into wealth, but into a silence of neglect, so loud it would echo through every choice he ever made. Born in 1931 to Irish immigrant parents in New York, Jimmy's earliest years were marked by abandonment. His father disappeared, his mother too unstable to care for him. And so, like so many future predators of the underworld, Jimmy was swallowed by the state, shuffled between foster homes, where cruelty was the daily bread. Reports from those who later dug into his past suggest that young Jimmy was beaten with belts, locked in closets, starved for days as punishment. There is one account, chilling in its detail, of him being forced to kneel on grains of rice for hours until his knees bled raw. That detail, whether true or exaggerated, carries a haunting logic. Cruelty carved into his bones before he ever learned to fight back. And like so many gangsters who came before, he learned the one lesson his foster fathers never meant to teach. If you want to survive, you must control fear. Bend it until you can wear it like armor. By his teens, Jimmy was already living by the code of the streets. Quiet, calculating, and dangerously disciplined. Unlike the loudmouth tough guys who swaggered into bars and left in handcuffs, Jimmy played the long game. He earned his nickname the Gent because he dressed sharp, tipped heavy, and smiled politely. Even as he plotted robbery, extortion, or worse, he cultivated an aura of respectability, the kind that fooled waiters, shopkeepers, and sometimes even cops. But underneath, his mind was wired like a predator's, always searching for an angle, always testing the edges of risk. By the 1950s, when organized crime in New York was swelling like a fever, Jimmy had found his place among the Irish crews who orbited the Italian mafia. Never quite members of the inner circle, but always indispensable muscle. He knew his heritage barred him from the mafia's sacred ritual of becoming a made man. Yet he wielded his outsider status like a weapon. If the Italians couldn't make him, they couldn't control him either. It was in these years that Jimmy honed his craft, not just as a thief, but as a mentor of thieves. He had an uncanny ability to recruit young men, hungry, angry, fatherless boys, who saw in him the role model they had been denied. Tommy DeSimone, Henry Hill, Angelo Sepe, names that would echo later in headlines, were shaped in Jimmy's shadow. He drilled into them the rules of survival. Never rat, always keep your mouth shut. Know the score before you sit at the table. Yet, he was also infamous for a rule he alone lived by. If there's money on the table, it's mine first. His generosity extended only until greed got in the way. And greed got in the way often. Jimmy's rise was not marked by flashy killings or drunken bar brawls, but by precision and patience. He learned to hijack trucks like a conductor directing a symphony, timing the approach, controlling the drivers, moving the goods within minutes so the evidence vanished into the night. By the late 1960s, he was considered one of the best hijackers in the entire city, so efficient that major trucking companies factored his thefts into their business costs, treating him like an invisible tax collector. Some investigators estimated that by the early 1970s, Burke's hijacking operations alone were worth millions annually, the equivalent of tens of millions in today's money. But Jimmy wasn't content to be a thief. He wanted something bigger, something mythic, and that something, the glittering jewel that would make him both feared and doomed, was the Lufthansa Heist. Chapter 2. The Lufthansa Dream. It began, as so many underworld legends do, with a whisper. In the mid-1970s, Jimmy Burke heard from a contact at Kennedy Airport rumors that cash shipments were flowing through Lufthansa's cargo terminal, unguarded, untraceable, and worth more than anyone dared say out loud. It wasn't street money. It wasn't hijacked televisions or stolen cigarettes. This was currency, flown directly from Europe, sometimes millions of dollars at a time, landing on American soil under the sleepy watch of airport police. To Jimmy, it was more than temptation. It was destiny. He began planning not like a thug, but like a general. Every detail mattered. The timing of the flights, the rotation of the guards, the habits of the night crews, the location of security cameras. He spent years cultivating informants, slipping envelopes to baggage handlers, buying drinks for airport cops, until they couldn't remember if their loyalty was to the badge or the Gent's smile. What makes the Lufthansa heist terrifying, even in hindsight, is the scale of its ambition. On December 11th, 1978, at 3:12 in the morning, 6 masked men, hand-picked and trained by Jimmy, stormed the cargo terminal. They weren't kids looking for a score. They were professionals, executing a plan rehearsed to the second. Within 64 minutes, they had subdued the guards, cut phone lines, and emptied the vault. When they fled into the night, they carried $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewels, the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that haul would be worth over $25 million today. It was a robbery so clean, so shocking, that the FBI called it the heist of the century. And at the center of it all, though not present at the scene, was Jimmy Burke, the spider at the center of a vast web of fear, greed, and betrayal. But here's where the story curdles into something darker. Success in the underworld doesn't taste sweet. It tastes like blood. Almost immediately, Jimmy became paranoid. He had trusted men to execute the plan, but he did not trust them to keep quiet, nor to resist flaunting their sudden wealth. And sure enough, within days, some of his crew began to betray the cardinal rule. Don't flash the money. Cars were bought, fur coats gifted, homes renovated. Each purchase was a neon sign pointing back to the robbery. And Jimmy's paranoia began to metastasize into something lethal. The bodies started piling up. Tommy DeSimone vanished, never seen again. Angelo Sepe was found in the trunk of a car. Parnell Stacks Edwards, careless in disposing of the getaway van, was shot in his apartment. Even those only loosely connected to the heist were erased. Historians of crime sometimes compare Burke to Macbeth. Ambitious, calculating, but undone by his own fear of betrayal. The Lufthansa heist, which should have crowned him as a legend, instead poisoned his empire. The FBI closed in, not because of the money, most of which was never recovered, but because of the blood trail Jimmy left behind. The irony is suffocating. The heist was perfect, but Jimmy's paranoia made it imperfect. His greatest victory became his downfall, and the Gent, once admired for his patience, became the author of his own undoing. And yet, here's the question that still chills investigators and historians alike. What happened to the money? Of the $5.8 million stolen, almost none of it was ever found. Was it buried in fields, hidden in offshore accounts, burned, destroyed, swallowed by corruption inside the mafia? Some claim Jimmy hoarded it in hidden caches, whispering to associates that the money would outlive him, that it was cursed. Others speculate the mafia bosses themselves siphoned it, using Jimmy as both mastermind and scapegoat. The truth, buried under decades of silence and murder, remains one of the darkest mysteries of American crime. Chapter 3. The Winter of Fear. The Lufthansa heist should have been Jimmy Burke's coronation. A crime so daring and so lucrative that it could have cemented his reputation as one of the most brilliant underworld tacticians in American history. But in the shadows of that December night, victory began to rot almost immediately, like meat left to fester in the cold. In the weeks after the robbery, Jimmy's paranoia became a living thing, an invisible presence that stalked every room he entered. He had pulled off the impossible. Yes, But now he was shackled to a crew of men who were loud, careless, and dazzled by their own sudden wealth. Each fur coat, each Cadillac, each champagne toast was a death sentence in his mind. Burke was a man obsessed with control, and when he felt that control slipping, he reached for the only solution he trusted: elimination. And so the killings began. Not in bursts of rage, but in carefully orchestrated silences. Stax Edwards, the guitarist turned getaway driver, was the first to fall. His failure to dispose of the van, a careless oversight that linked them to the crime, was enough to mark him for death. Burke sent men to his apartment, and Stax was found slumped in a pool of blood, his television still flickering in the corner, the echoes of music still on the air. To Jimmy, it was a necessary sacrifice, a reminder to the others that mistakes had no half-life. But the killings didn't stop with mistakes. They spread like contagion. Tommy DeSimone, hot-headed and unpredictable, vanished without a trace. Angelo Sepe turned up stuffed in a car trunk. Dominic Ramo Kersani was erased just as quietly. The paranoia spread until the Lufthansa crew was more ghost than flesh, and the FBI agents watching from the outside marveled at how quickly the men who had pulled off the heist of the century disappeared into the dirt of shallow graves. What makes this period so chilling is not just the body count, but the psychology behind it. Jimmy Burke was not a man who killed for sport, nor even for revenge. He killed for control. His philosophy was surgical. Dead men don't talk, and silence was worth more than loyalty. It is said that during this time, Jimmy would sit in Robert's Lounge, his headquarters in Queens, sipping whiskey and watching his remaining associates with eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. Some swore that he would suddenly go quiet, mid-conversation, staring at a man as if measuring whether he would live another week. And often, those stares were a death sentence, disguised as thought. The lounge itself became infamous. A neighborhood bar where laughter could fill the air one night, and by the next, its regulars were found in rivers, alleys, or nothing but rumors of screams muffled in basements. FBI files from the era describe Burke's presence as haunting, spectral, a man who seemed more ghost than gangster, as though he already knew he was digging his own grave, one body at a time. Yet what terrified his crew most was not the killings, it was his calm. He smiled as he plotted murders, patted backs as he handed down death sentences, whispered reassurances even as he loaded men into cars bound for their final drive. It was this mask of warmth, this false sense of safety, that made Jimmy Burke a monster, far more unsettling than the brutes who sprayed bullets in alleys. Because with Jimmy, you never saw the bullet coming. You only felt the silence that followed. And as the winter of fear deepened, so too did the sense that the Lufthansa money was cursed. None of the men who touched it lived long enough to enjoy it. Even those on the edges of the plot, the girlfriends, the wives, the friends who knew too much, found themselves vanishing into shallow graves, or forever looking over their shoulders. The FBI, desperate to break the case, leaned harder, bugged phones, tailed cars. But what they found was a labyrinth of corpses, leading back to one man, Jimmy Burke. And though they could never pin the robbery itself on him, the paranoia and bloodshed were evidence enough of his guilt. Still, Jimmy walked freely in those years, uncharged, untouchable, as though protected by the very fear he cultivated. Yet each passing day tightened the noose, not of the law, but of destiny, because even for Jimmy the Gent, the winter of fear would not last forever. And in the shadows, the FBI was patient, waiting for the moment his empire would crumble from within. Chapter 4. The net closes. By the early 1980s, the noose was tightening. Jimmy Burke, once untouchable, was now a man surrounded by ghosts and hunted by lawmen who had grown tired of chasing shadows. The Lufthansa money had vanished into the ether, leaving behind nothing but questions and bodies, and the FBI had shifted strategy. If they couldn't convict Jimmy for the heist, they would bleed him through every other crime he had ever touched, and there were plenty. Burke's world was not built on Lufthansa alone. It was built on decades of hijackings, loan sharking, extortion, and murder. Every truck that vanished off a New York highway, every debtor who disappeared after failing to pay, every whisper of a body buried under concrete led back, in some way, to the Gent. But the break came not from the FBI's brilliance, but from betrayal. Henry Hill, Burke's protege, his surrogate son, the man who once worshipped him, turned government witness after facing his own charges. It was Hill who peeled back the mask, telling prosecutors how Burke ran his empire, how he handled money, how he dealt with disobedience, with a shovel, a gun, and silence. It was Hill's testimony that shattered the illusion of Jimmy the Gent as merely a thief. It painted him as the architect of a murder machine. The trial that followed was less about Lufthansa and more about the aura of Burke himself. Prosecutors dragged his name through blood and fear, presenting him as a man who ruled with quiet terror, who killed not because he had to, but because he believed it was the only language his world respected. Witness after witness described him as charming one moment, chilling the next. Jurors heard how he smiled while discussing murder, how he planned killings as casually as business meetings. They saw the pattern, the disappearances after Lufthansa, the silence of men who had once laughed loudly in his presence. And while no jury could convict him for the heist itself, too much time, too little evidence, they found him guilty of other crimes: racketeering, extortion, and most damning of all, murder. In 1985, Burke was sentenced to life in prison, a cage he could never charm his way out of. For a man who had spent his life outmaneuvering the law, the silence of that gavel was deafening. Prison did not soften Jimmy. In fact, it seemed to preserve him in a strange, unsettling way. Guards reported that he was polite, even fatherly to younger inmates, offering advice, telling stories of the old days. But behind his smile was the same cold glint that had unnerved his crew decades before. Some prisoners whispered that he still ran rackets from inside, moving money through visitors, controlling men on the outside with letters smuggled through the walls. Others swore he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that even in prison he would be silenced by the mafia bosses who had once tolerated his independence. His health began to fail, cancer eating away at him, but his aura of menace never faded. When he died in 1996, at age 64, it was not with the violent flourish of the streets, but in the sterile quiet of a prison hospital. And yet, even in death, Burke left behind questions too heavy to bury. Where was the Lufthansa money? Who else had died to protect it? And was Jimmy himself a victim of the very paranoia he had sown? Murdered slowly, not by bullets but by a lifetime of fear gnawing from within. To this day, investigators, historians, and true crime obsessives argue over the wreckage he left behind. The Lufthansa heist remains unsolved in the eyes of the law. No one was ever convicted for it. The money remains missing, as though swallowed by the earth itself. And Jimmy Burke remains a legend, a ghost story whispered in New York bars, a name that still makes old men lower their voices. He was the Gent, the smiling killer, the architect of the heist that should have made him immortal, but instead became his curse. And perhaps that is the true terror of Jimmy Burke's story. Not that he stole millions, not that he killed without hesitation, but that in the end, his greatest crime destroyed him from the inside out. A reminder that in the underworld, victory is always temporary, and the shadows always come to collect their debt. Chapter 5. The Curse of the Lufthansa. Millions. Jimmy Burke's death in 1996 should have ended the story. A gangster's tale neatly folded into the archives of organized crime. But like all great criminal legends, his life left behind threads that refused to be tied off, questions that festered into something larger than fact. At the heart of it was the Lufthansa money, the $5.8 million in cash, and nearly $900,000 in jewels that vanished that cold December night in 1978. Almost none of it was ever recovered, and that silence became its own myth, a curse that clung not just to Jimmy, but to anyone who touched the heist. Some believe Jimmy hoarded the money in hidden caches, scattered across Queens and Brooklyn, wrapping bundles of bills in plastic, burying them beneath basements, construction sites, even cemeteries where no one would dare dig. Others speculate that the mafia bosses above him quietly siphoned off the cash, allowing Burke to take the heat while they absorbed the fortune into legitimate businesses, laundering it until the blood was washed away, and it grew into skyscrapers and boardrooms. There are even stranger whispers that Burke himself deliberately destroyed some of the money, burning it in fear that the FBI would one day find his caches, a desperate act of control over the very curse that haunted him. But the curse of the Lufthansa millions was not just about missing cash. It was about what the money seemed to do to men's souls. Look at the aftermath. Every member of the crew dead, missing, or rotting in prison. Associates who had nothing to do with the robbery, but merely brushed against it, ended up face down in alleys, strangled in cars, or vanished without a trace. Wives, girlfriends, cousins, anyone who saw too much or spoke too loudly was swallowed by the silence, Jimmy demanded. Even Henry Hill, who survived by betraying the code and entering witness protection, never truly escaped. He lived the rest of his life haunted, moving from place to place, drinking, unraveling in public interviews, where he admitted he still dreamed of Jimmy staring at him from the shadows. It was as if the money itself had a malevolent spirit, an invisible hand that demanded blood from anyone who dared claim it. Lawmen who worked the case admitted later that they sometimes felt cursed too, that every lead they chased ended not in answers, but in more bodies. For decades, the Lufthansa heist was treated less like an unsolved case and more like a ghost story. Proof that in the world of organized crime, certain treasures are too dangerous to touch. Even today, almost half a century later, the curse lingers. Urban explorers at JFK Airport swear that some nights, when the air is heavy and the wind cuts across the runways, you can hear faint voices near the old cargo terminal where the heist took place. Some say it's just the sound of planes and machinery. Others insist it's the echoes of that night in 1978, the muffled shouts of guards, the slam of vault doors, the rush of money being loaded into bags that would never be seen again. There are construction workers in Queens who claim to have dug into soil and found decayed scraps of old bills, green paper flaking like dry leaves. Whether these stories are true or not almost doesn't matter, because what Jimmy Burke left behind was not just a crime, not just a missing fortune, but a legend, a shadow draped over New York's underworld, whispering that even the perfect crime carries a price, and sometimes that price is the soul of everyone who touches it. And so, the story of Jimmy the Gent Burke drifts into silence, a tale that begins with ambition and ends with ghosts. He was a man who pulled off the heist of the century, yet lived his final years in a cage, his body eaten away by cancer, his mind gnawed by the same paranoia that had once made him powerful. He left behind no legacy of family, no monument of love, only whispers of cash that may or may not still lie hidden under the streets of New York, guarded not by locks but by curses. In the end, Jimmy's story is not about wealth or even crime. It is about the emptiness that power leaves behind, the way greed swallows loyalty, and the way shadows never let go once they have claimed a man. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the noise of Jimmy's world fade. Let the blood, the fear, the whispered curses dissolve into the quiet of your room. Outside, the night may still carry its own mysteries. But in here, you are safe, you are still, you are untouchable. Breathe slowly and feel the story fade into the background, like the hum of a distant engine. The gent is gone, the money is gone, the curse belongs to another time. All that remains for you is rest. So close your eyes, let the shadows recede, and allow yourself to slip into dreams where no debts are owed, no fear lingers, and the night keeps its silence.